Good afternoon, everybody. That's indeed the origin of the word scout. I feel as though we're fighting the weather today, so thank you all for coming indoors for just a little while on this absolutely gorgeous day. We've had actual winter, haven't we? It's been amazing. And our new fireplace departed the other night. Rob and I were so furious. We're used to sitting by the fire, and it stopped the igniter. That's the trouble when you have, too much technology instead of like a match. so there we are. Anyway, I am thrilled to welcome back Charles Finch, who, as we agreed at lunch just a little while ago, he's been with me since he was a pup. In fact, his very first book. And Charlie was also our first writer in residence. Lord, how long ago was that? 6 years, 7 years ago?
Yeah, I think, but yeah.
Well, your baby was brand new.
2015. So
Okay.
2014.
So how old is your daughter? We can work it out from there.
She's 31. So no, she's 5. So yeah, she was new, and she sat on Barbara's lap and played with her big chunky necklace and got all excited.
Yeah, she was so cute. She really was great. And today is another Victorian crime writer whom I'm very, very fond and really love her books, Karen Odden. So Karen has agreed to chime in with us today and talk a bit about Victorian. And I see Diane Freeman over there. And I have a discovery for you two guys. I read a book yesterday, and I just got in the first novel in this. I'm never entirely sure whether it's tongue-in-cheek or serious when I read something like it. You can't be sure. So I'm going to read the first one, and then if I decide it's really serious, I'm going to. It's all right to be funny, right, Diane? You're a master of that. But, there's parody and then there's fiction, right? So we're going to find out.
I'm so lost. What book was it and what
I'm not mentioning names till I finish, but Diane is what prompted me because I thought to myself, Diane would love this book, but I'm going to read the other one before I
Got it.
I sell books to authors, that's what I do.
It's really true.
I know, that's the deal. So, Karen, what would you like to ask Charlie?
Wait, can I say something first? I usually would defer to Karen immediately, but so this book that I wrote has a murder that takes place on a train, and Barbara chose to very casually mention over lunch that Karen has a PhD in train wrecks. So you're lucky I'm even here. I'm prepared for the full Frost-Nixon interrogation. I'm so sorry about all the trains in the book preemptively, and now please take it away.
I am all happy about Victorian and trains, and by the way, I think our covers are really complimentary, the green and the gold. I'm really happy about that. They look very nice together. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So I did do my dissertation at NYU almost 20 years ago now in Victorian literature, and I was looking at railway disasters, specifically the way that they were represented in popular fiction, medical fiction, parliamentary papers, newspapers, songs, gravestones. They were kind of everywhere, because I was interested in looking at where the origins of trauma came from, and the doctors and a lot of the novelists were reporting incidents of people being in train wrecks and coming out of them with what we would now call PTSD. Charles Dickens was in one, shaking, buzzing in his ears, couldn't sign his name, all that kind of thing. So yes, I did write my dissertation on railway disasters. I'm not an expert in causing them, just in the way that the literature and the discourse surrounding them was eventually appropriated by people like Freud, and then eventually appropriated by people later on who were talking about shell shock in World War I. You can trace it all the way back. So that's why I'm interested in trains, but I love the fact, and I'm not going to do too much of a spoiler here, but I get to, whatever page it was.
The train did the murder.
And there's a dead man in the third-class carriage. I'm like, yay! So I think the trains are really interesting because of the way that they both stabilized classes, but also fiddled with them, and also provided some very interesting spaces for men and women to interact in different ways. So the fact that you've got a train in here made me really happy. So why did you decide to start with the train?
Well, I'm regretting it now.
No.
No.
Make me happy.
I love Victorian rail culture. I don't know. Are there great mysteries about Victorian trains?
There's a whole series by Edward Marston, who's
Really?
actually named Keith Miles, which is called Yeah, the railroad mysteries, and it is in fact Victorian or possibly Edwardian, but I'm pretty sure Victorian. Because you have to remember that that's really, the first great mass transportation system. We had ships, and we had improvements in the Victorian era where ships went from wind power to other kinds of power. And we had, stagecoaches and all the rest of it. But trains were the thing. They certainly made the United States the country that it is after the Civil War in particular. And I learned all that as an undergraduate at Stanford because, we learned Senator Stanford and the Golden Spike and the whole bit about the first transcontinental railroad here, so it transformed this country. But I don't know that we realized how much in Victorian England, how much of the canal building and train building was really private enterprise, was capitalism in action. And to be honest, they haven't upgraded a lot of it since. So when I've never forgotten it, and then I'll shut up. I was in Manchester at a mystery conference and staying at Val McDermott's home, and this huge blizzard hit England, whereupon the planes couldn't fly, the motorways couldn't be plowed, so nobody could do anything, and the trains all came to a stop because they're so old that either the heat or the cold would expand the rails, and so they couldn't run. They had the same problem in a heat wave. So they actually have not upgraded much of the rail beds in England since they were built in the Victorian era, and I don't know what they're ever going to do about that. So we could have modern railroad disasters if you want to, because they're still in England. That probably is easier to take a train than it is to fly most of the time.
Oh, for sure. Or drive, it's almost always. This is not a train book per se, but it has a bunch of scenes at Paddington, and I did like that. I feel like this is especially true in Sherlock Holmes. There are so many worlds colliding, because the Queen had her own special train, and a Duke would come into the train station. They actually had like a carriageway that would come into Paddington Station, so you didn't even have to get out of your horse-drawn carriage. And at the same time, some of the poorest people in the country would be itinerants riding the rails, and there would be little boys and girls selling, they would sell lavender as bird feed. Just the most meager sales you can imagine.
It's a huge status symbol to have your own railway car.
That's
right.
Today,
you have your own jet, but back then, your own railway car was the thing.
That's exactly right. Or you could hire a private if you really needed to get somewhere quickly, and that was considered. So there were all these interesting, we're lecturing Karen about it, who did her PhD on it. But no, I loved that about it, and I thought it would be neat if there was a murder on a train. Now, why did I write this book? I'm going back in my head. I just thought it would be, so the real thing that came into my head first was, what if there were a murder with no clues? Because I've written now so many of these books, 10 or 11 or something, that I wanted to set myself a new challenge, and that was like the fun part for me. Was so all the stitching is removed from his jacket, and you can't identify him by a wallet or anything like that, the murder victim, and the detective, Charles Lennox, has to piece everything together from there.
And I think that he even says, usually I begin with a victim. I know who it is, and I have to find out why. And here you've got this extra step of, I don't even know who this is, and I have to find out who it is first before I find out why.
Right, exactly.
It's a really neat premise.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, and it's the last of these prequels that I've done, which I feel a little sad to be leaving them behind. He's very young in this book, and I've written 3 where he's young, and now I'm trying to transition back into writing about him as a person of middle age, and it's difficult. I don't know. Do you have any tips?
You don't actually have to completely given up the prequels. You can now write Lennox in middle age, but there's nothing to prevent you from going back again.
I guess that's
true.
There's
a lot of years between where you're leaving him and where we first met him in your first book, so it's not impossible for you to zigzag back and forth.
Well, he can get to the bottom of the scone thing with that word.
Actually, it'd be kind of interesting to write a prequels right up to the point where we first met him.
Yes.
Wouldn't it?
Yes.
You could really do that.
I would love that.
Yeah, if I could only write. So I have great plot ideas. I think it would really be fun. And Karen's doing something really interesting. Instead of writing a series, what are you doing? Because I think your idea is a great one.
So I set all of my books in the 1870s in and around London. So that's my community, and I pluck a different heroine out each time. So the first one, it's a young woman. She and her mom are in a railway disaster. That's where I got that idea. So she and her mom are in a railway disaster on their way home from London after the season. They're heading back to their estate and up north, and they are in a crash. And then the next book is about a young woman who lives in London with her brother, who's an inspector at Scotland Yard, and she desperately wants to attend the Royal Academy of Music, but she doesn't have any money. So she dresses up as a man because they get paid more, and goes over to Soho and gets a job in a music hall, which is also a front for a shady organization. And then in the third one, this Trace of Deceit, it's about a young woman who is one of the first female students at the Slade School of Art, which was founded in 1871. And it is the first one in England where the men and the women were allowed to study together. So, but she has an older brother who is a ne'er-do-well forger or former opium addict, and
we've all been there.
I know. And so each one of my books is set, and there's some overlapping characters, like some inspectors. I've got a very plain-spoken newspaperman named Tom Flynn. He appears in all of them. But I don't trust myself to do, frankly, what you've done so well, and keep to one person without getting bored. To do a series like that. So that's why I pluck everybody out and sort of do that instead.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's so smart.
It's a great idea. But I have to say, you haven't read all of Charlie's books, right?
No, I've only read about
What?
5 of them. I know,
Right,
sorry.
okay.
Please see yourself out.
So,
I'm just kidding.
so I bring that up because one of the characters that's been missing all along is Lady Jane's first husband. And so in this book, he's the central character. He and
He's so likable.
He is likable,
Thank you.
and I found that whole thing to be really fascinating.
Thank you so much.
He was dead when we first in the first when we start the whole series.
Yeah.
Lady Jane's a widow, right?
The series
So-
actually started as a zombie series.
So we know that somehow or other he died, but back in the prequels, he's very much alive, and I think he's he's
Thank
a
you so
lovely
much.
guy, and he obviously has a lot to do with who she is and who she becomes, in the later books. I think it's really fascinating, to have gotten to know them, and then to go back and see how they got to be the people that they are.
Well, and some of the traits that, sorry, I'm forgetting his name. It begins with D. Dear? No.
Dear,
Dear,
yeah, sorry.
Dear. That he has, it's very interesting because in the books that are chronologically later, we see some of these traits. Charlie has them. Charles Lennox has them. And you kind of wonder, okay, did he see that example before him, young, and then kind of grow into it a little bit? I think.
Oh, that's interesting. I was very conscious of not wanting to create a character who was sort of a throwaway, so that it's like, well, these two should have been together all along, and she just made a mistake. Like, I wanted to give Lady Jane more credit than that. Like, I don't think she would ever have married someone she didn't love and respect. And I wanted to, I remember when I've been married now for 10 years, but when we were first dating, I'd be like, oh, what did you even see in Justin? I'd be like, I would be so jealous, and it seems silly to me now, but I was like, I had that temperament, and my wife would be like, why do you even care? And now I'm like, well, I'm sure they were all nice. Like, she didn't have to stop for me because she didn't even know I existed. So I wanted to try to humanize a character who I had sort of thought of when I started writing the series as a throwaway character, and sort of bring him, so I tried to make him a human being instead of just like a plot point in Charles Lennox's life, which is, how we all are to each other. We're all living our own protagonist journeys, but there are all these other people around, so, yeah.
So why did you think that Jane should be a widow when you wrote the first book? Because arbitrarily, when you write a first book, you have to choose who these people are and how old they are and what their lives are. Why did you think, there's a good reason I can think of, but why you...
Please tell it to me.
No, seriously.
At the time, I think I wanted her to have an element of maturity that he did not. I wrote the first one when I was 24, and I was...
A pup.
Yeah. I'm still not mature, but I'm more mature than I was then. And I wanted her to have sort of a gravity that maybe he didn't in his life. And also, you know, to be a little bit unattainable, maybe? I don't know, what were you thinking would be the...
Well, I was being more practical because that's my nature. I was thinking about how difficult it would have been if were unmarried. She couldn't have been living alone.
That's true.
Or with a chaperone in the house next door and spending any time with him. She would have been caught up in that whole young woman, heavily chaperoned, etc., without her own money and without her own independence. So for what you wanted to happen in those early books, I think she had to be a widow.
Well, I remember I read all throughout college, I read, you know, George Eliot or whoever, and it all seemed totally normal to me. And then I just reread one of them, and it was like she had long since given up on the idea of marriage. She had just celebrated her 25th birthday. And I was just like, Jesus. And I think at the time I must have thought, like, oh yeah, well, everything was so accelerated. I'm sure you know well that...
But they got married at 16 and 17. You know,
Right,
25 was
exactly.
really on the shelf, as we used to say. Part of it was because marriage, a lot of it was about childbearing, you know, providing family continuity and all.
That's
and
right.
Younger women were considered to be more likely to reproduce successfully than older women. But it is weird to read about people in their 20s, you know, considered to be way past it. Really? When people are having babies now in their 50s, and you know.
Seriously.
And I always think about, like, if I could marry someone from all of history, I guess I would choose my wife. Is she watching? Hi, I am. But, no, I would choose my wife. But after her, I might choose Jane Austen, who died having never married, because I think she has the most interesting brain of anyone I've ever encountered. And she had that story. She had maybe one romantic encounter that didn't quite end up as she expected. I'm sure Francine could tell us a lot more detail, but... And then just never married. And if you look where she wrote, it was the size of this table, and it's in a little nook, and it's just amazing to think of her life, like this great brilliance. I mean, I guess the love of her life was her sister in a way. What am I talking about? Where am I?
No, you're trying, I mean, and by the way, Jane's having a real moment because, you know, Sanditon has been on. You can read,
How is that?
You can read Dana and my critique of Sanditon, should you wish to.
No good?
Not totally favorable in terms of the plot, no. And that made me think about the young woman, because the young woman in Sanditon contradicts many of the accepted things that would be true of young women at that time. She, you know, her dress, her being down, she's off by herself doing, she never could have done any of that and maintained a respectable reputation. But I am excited to see there's a new version of Emma coming out soon, I think, isn't it? And that ought to be interesting. It has I think an intriguing cast. I'm trying to remember who was playing Emma's father, somebody.
Bill Nye.
Thank you, Bill Nye, who I think is terrific.
He's always so
Yeah,
good.
so I think, you know, Jane, she wrote 6 novels, right? And then Lady Susan, the Watsons, and Sanditon that we don't really think of. And a little bit of Jophenalia, but think of the effect that she has had. Still a bestseller, still making movies, you know, and she died in 18, I think it was. It's a long time dead for still being a bestseller.
I mean, I think that she wrote the greatest novel ever written, probably, Pride and Prejudice, just in terms of as a piece of craft combined with artistry. I think it might be my choice. Is that crazy?
I like Persuasion better, but that's okay.
But would you
like
say
which
that
one
if you were
better?
reading them both?
I like Persuasion better. Persuasion is my personal favorite.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
probably my personal favorite, but would you say that if you were reading them both for the first time?
I don't know. I think Pride and Prejudice has had so many film adaptations.
That's what I
It's
mean.
almost impossible. I mean, how many people have actually read The Maltese Falcon as compared to thinking of it with Humphrey Bogart? You know. I know, but I mean, you know, many of us think we've read books that, in fact, we never have. We've seen.
This is getting really deep. What have I not read?
It's really true. I think that, well, for example, the ABC Murders was just on. We were talking about that last week, and there's a whole new deal with John Malkovich as Poirot, and he's absolutely nothing like Poirot. And then unnervingly, Rob and I watched something the other night with David Suchet cast And his voice, you know, you expect him to sound like a Belgian detective, and instead he's got this terrific Oxonian, very deep voice, and I'm going, whoa, you know. So I do think that film, you know, actors and film adaptations actually do affect the memories of things that we have read or never read, but think we've read.
Well, I've never read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which maybe has the most famous ending or twist by Agatha Christie. Maybe has the most famous twist in
Don't say what it is.
mystery history. And what it is, no. And I never read it because I heard the twist, and I was like, well, I guess I can't read it now. I mean, but maybe I still should. I mean, it's a glaring hole in my... Are you an Agatha Christie person? How did you come by the Victorian era?
Oh, just because I was studying it in grad school and wrote my dissertation and you know, in Victorian, and then I ended up doing like some introductions for Barnes & Noble, Victorian books, you know, like that kind of thing, and then I got roped into being an assistant editor for Victorian Literature and Culture, which is an academic journal that 3 people read, and and so I just, and then my son teases me that I, you know, because I always have to hand my phone to him, and he's like, you really belong in Victorian England, you really don't belong here. So that's I just got stuck there.
So it wasn't fiction; it was the history first.
It was a lot of the history and studying Victorian literature, and also getting to the point where I had read enough around and felt that the 1870s were, I think, an astonishing decade. As far as
well, elaborate. What do you mean?
Well, there were a lot of things going on in the 1860s as far as in sort of like the public in the public eye, and in the 1870s, some of these social concerns began to be codified into law. For example, the Married Woman's Property Act, which for the first time ever drove that little wedge into coverture and said a woman who worked for her wages, for example, at a mill, could keep her wages. They did not belong to her husband. And that was revolutionary. It was a little tiny like slice in there. The Education Act was passed, which made it mandatory for all children ages 6 to 12 to be educated. And dozens of these things, and they were all kind of in that first 1870 to 1875, right in there. So I just think it's a really interesting period.
I agree, and I mean there were also famously 6 or 7 bad harvests in succession, and at the same time refrigeration had just come in. We're deep in the weeds now, but you could get Minnesota wheat in the summer. It didn't just have to be. You weren't just counting on English wheat, and so people lost their jobs on farms, came to the city and realized you don't have to make £3 a year working for the local Duke. So all these that's why they needed all these American heiresses to come in and marry them, because all the farmers were fleeing for the cities. And the American, I mean, to your point, the American girls, I think there's a quote from David Cecil or someone like that, the American girls gave them more pleasure in an hour than they had known a woman could provide in a lifetime, because they were educated, they were full of, you know, spark. There was a real sense in America that women had been among the pioneers equals, and so there was a sense that American women should be held to this really high standard of education, and that they should be treated well. Daughters were equals to sons, which was totally inimical to the English attitude. And so these Americans would come over to England and land a husband within 6 hours, because these people would be like, what is this alien doing here who does everything and knows everything?
I had never
like
thought about
Jenny
the
Churchill.
Churchills.
Yeah,
Exactly,
that was really true.
exactly.
And then they got Mrs. Simpson, which said everything.
And now we have Meghan Markle.
I know, I wasn't going to mention that, but yes, indeed, the English royal family has not done as well out of Americans as, let's say, the Marlborough family. But so it goes. So Charlie, why did you start to write about Victoria? You've written one contemporary novel,
That's
The
right,
Last
yeah.
Enchantment, set at Oxford, and part of your experience there. But what was it that drew you to writing Charles Lennox?
I have a lot of thoughts about it that evolve over time. I guess the real answer is that I just, I think everyone in adolescence, is this true, picks out something that they find refuge in, because it's so hard to be a teenager. And when you're 14 or 15, you need, whether it's Pokemon or, I don't know, what do people like? Sports, I mean, whatever it might be. And for me, it was just always books, and specifically it was these writers like Sherlock Holmes and Elizabeth Gaskell and P.G. Wodehouse and writers like that. And so I felt as if I inhabited that world so fully that when it came time to write, it just felt natural to write in it, which seems very odd. I'd never been to England when I wrote my first Victorian mystery. But I felt completely at home there. And now I no longer read as much about England, but I still feel like I always can go back there in my mind. It's funny.
It's harder to write. It's harder to write a series set in another country if you have not been there, or you have a real tie to it. And the British are often very critical of writers who who don't do that. So Elizabeth George used to take a tremendous amount of heat, and Deborah Crombie for a long time didn't have a British publisher, for example, because they were Americans trying to write in a British voice. But I don't recall that sort of criticism leveled at your books, particularly.
Well, I'm just really good, so no, I've gotten plenty.
Well, that's the obvious answer.
No, I've gotten so much criticism from British readers who well, it's mostly minutia. So like I put Sidewalk in one book, which is the single greatest regret of my life, because I get an email about it once a week. Were you aware that in this? Like, yes, I was aware of that. I've gotten 475 emails. Or waste paper basket, and there's a lot of you and I type stuff that people are very touchy about. But I feel I care more about atmosphere than about facts. Is that bad to admit in front of a historian?
No, I think that your job is to be convincing, and most American readers won't ding you for that kind of thing, and that's your primary audience. But you've always liked exploring interesting parts of British culture. I mean, you've written one about counterfeiting, and you've written about sailing or the Navy. You've written about Parliament, because Lennox has had a parliamentary career, which she's now abandoned and has gone back to sleuthing. I'm trying to think of all the different aspects of.
Well, this one is sort of the one where I get most deeply into. There's really not that many trains, if any of you are scared about that. This one is the one where I had to research the most deeply and learn the most about what it was like to get married back then, because there's a love story for the young Lennox, and I really didn't. I'd never had to research that. Have you had to sort of just like the process of how you would propose and calling on the young lady's mother and all of this? I had to. No.
Yeah, no, I don't really have it in.
So Lennox has sort of an affair of the heart in this one, and to write a female character who would tantalize him, and also who he could maybe summon the energy to want to marry, it was a real challenge, and I had to read a lot about what the balls were like and things like that. Does that sound boring?
No, actually, there's a tremendous amount of ritual, and I was fascinated to discover recently, I don't remember in what context, that married women, the big luxury of being a married woman was that you didn't have to dress and go down to breakfast. You could have breakfast brought to you in bed, which you could not do if you were a single lady. And I have no idea where that particular ritual would have come from.
The other one is that if you were married, you could wear green, because if you were single and wore green was associated with lasciviousness, because it was presumed in the time of around the Tudors that you had been rolling around in the grass and gotten and that's where the song Green Sleeves comes from.
So this is one of the, okay, there are two things that I truly admire about your books. Okay, one of them is these little historical bits that are slipped in, and they're dropped in, they're feathered in. They're not. You don't get some big clunky paragraph of here's a piece of history. And I got to the part about the green sleeves, and I had to laugh because of course I've got a woman in a green dress, and apparently that was very indecent. Yeah.
I think it was probably just cool.
No, it made me laugh. But the other piece that I find myself smiling a lot when I'm reading your books.
Aww,
and
that's so nice.
I was saying to my friend Judith here that my heroines tend to be loyal and earnest and passionate. They do not tend to be funny. And you seem to drop in these little bits of funny. And in fact, can I read one?
Oh, yes, please. Okay. Read the whole book. Can we start on page 1?
Okay. All right. So, well, I've got two little ones that I had to stick my little paper on here. Okay, they're one-liners, and they almost slip by without you noticing, and then you catch them, and then you smile, and then you keep going. So here's one of them. Across the room, he saw a whole legion of further potential wives, and saw them see him. some of them, he couldn't help but feel with less than absolutely maximal excitement. At a party like this, everyone was hoping to see someone or other, and so often it wasn't you. Here's another one of my favorites. I love
That's
this.
based on personal experience. People not wanting to see me.
Well, I think, well, no, it's funny because we've all been in that, well, I've been in that situation.
Of course,
Maybe
yeah.
all of you have not, but I've been in that situation before, and it's almost like it's a wink and a nod to your reader, you know, kind of like a nudge, and here we keep going. And then,
Thank you so much.
and here was another one that I really loved. It said, he's saying, you can hardly call that a career of crime. Edmund, his older brother, once stole another boy's cricket bat. I think we both thought we were going to be taken to the Tower of London and beheaded. There's an awful lot of beheading chatter when you have a tutor just down from Oxford and writing a history of the monarchy. I mean, really, like this is the kind of stuff, and you come across it, and I kept wanting to put little smiley faces on it.
Aw,
So,
thank you.
But I think that that's one of the things that you do very, very well.
That is so kind of you.
And I completely enjoy it. So.
Thank you so much. My favorite compliment I've ever received is I was speaking at a university in Missouri, and a woman came up to me and said, I really disliked your book, but you could tell all the words were in the right place. And I thought, well, I'm going to remember that because I know she's being honest. She obviously has no filter. But thank you so much. That's so kind of you.
Do you know other? I mean, actually, Diane is also very, very good at the kind of like one-line humor, like that's sliding it in there. But who else do you feel does a really good job at humor with mysteries?
Oh, I want to know.
I have an author that I edit called Maggie Robinson, who I think does a wonderful job with her series doing that kind of thing. But I was thinking more broadly what you said is that Charlie's books are always good humored. And the one that was the most difficult in that respect, and I'm trying to remember, when he went after, I don't remember which book it is, some prominent man, and he was convinced he was never going to be able to bring him down.
Right.
And he really felt despaired. I think it's the only book I can remember in which Lennox really feels, despaired that he is not going to, he's depressed and all the rest, that he's not going to be able to do what he wants to do. On the obverse, one of the really great things about the series is the sense of family life, and particularly the book where Lennox is back in his childhood home and witnessing his brother and his brother's wife, doing the job that that people did.
That's right.
Who
Home by Nightfall.
was a lovely book about life in the smaller town, but also about the obligations of a good member of the landed gentry.
Right. The squire's obligation.
Yes,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, and I think his brother is a wonderful character.
Oh gosh, this is the best. Can you guys just do this all day?
And obviously their father was, or he could have brought up, sons to be like. And Lennox misses his father.
It's true.
Yeah, and I think the parliamentary career that he embarked on was in part like he felt like he missed a step in what his responsibilities as a member of this gentry should be, and so he stepped in and did that. So I really like that, that whole family, they're a good family, they're good people.
Thank you. Yeah, I think he experiences a lot of tension, which maybe comes from me indirectly, of the expectations you think your parents would have for you versus maybe what you expect of yourself. It's hard to really know yourself. Who are you? I mean, you're the legacy of these people who are in some ways, important ways, strangers to you. So yeah, he thinks about his father a lot in this book as well, and tries to piece together, well, who was my father?
And that's true of Jane also. Who were Jane's parents, and Jane's husband, as we've already mentioned, and so forth. So, they're very dimensional characters. I think your books are, they're character driven. The plots are good. I mean, I always like the plots, but I think that
some of them.
No, why? So when you don't like?
There's 3 I don't like.
Well, tell us which ones they are.
Absolutely not. If you buy them all, email me. I'll tell you what the 3 bad ones. Just send the receipt.
Why don't you like them? Do you feel like you didn't bring them off, or were they badly premised to begin with?
I always think about this this image from House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, where she's like, Lily Bart's life from the other side seemed like a Persian carpet, like this beautiful, intricate flowing, but she's on the other side where she can see all the little threads hanging loose. And I think that's what it's like to be a writer. Do you agree? I don't know. It's like all I see is, oh, I could have done this a little better. But the 3 books that I think are plotted badly, I think I didn't have enough of a sense that stuff is supposed to happen in books. Have you ever read a book where just like nothing really happened? It's so embarrassing.
Are those your early ones?
Yeah, thanks.
I'm just thinking about how, one of my questions I had for you that I sort of wanted to ask.
Why are the early books so terrible?
How have you evolved as a writer?
No, you're absolutely right. I think with most writers, and I'd be curious what it was for you. You either start with like a sense of language and character, or a sense of like, oh, I need to tell this story. Like I think Stephen King, when he was 10, probably ran home and said, I got to tell you about this, story, and then his sort of language is developed. For me, it was about atmosphere and character, and I think the first few books ride that pretty hard, and the plot is not as interesting for me. But I might just be being self-critical. It's very hard to know how to judge your own distance from your work. Do you experience that? I don't know.
Yes, I certainly do. And my first one, while people liked it generally, the criticism was the plot is a little bit slow. So I was beginning with a character who has this fraught relationship with her mother, and really has to, as in all my books, has to discover something about her past in order to be able to move through to her present and resolve whatever mystery it is. The problem is most people are not really all that interested in my character.
Right.
They want more of a mystery plot. And so I found I had to figure out how to balance that. Do you feel
sounds
like
like we're similar. Yeah.
Now?
Yeah, I think it's like learning to hit a backhand. You just get better at it as time goes by, and I've done it so often now that I'm like, well, this is where I need a little pace and a little whatever. But yeah, I think, Barbara, you've probably read 10,000 books where not enough happens, right? I mean,
it's one of the distinctions I make between literary fiction and crime fiction. Is that literary fiction, Charlie and I were talking at lunch about a book that's getting a lot of buzz, and it's being put out there as a mystery or a thriller or something, and it isn't. So I read the first 125 pages last night, then I read the last 25 pages to confirm my suspicion that wasn't actually a mystery. And so, there is a person who dies, and there are questions about it, but a mystery really, I think, requires some investigation. There needs to be some, what we call the instigating incident, but something that needs to happen that finding out about it is what drives the sleuth and the other people, and you, the reader, all the way through to the end to see what happens. And it's, if you discover at the end, as this particular book, that it was just an accident and, a bunch of other stuff. It's not a crime fiction, it's a perfectly nice book that has a lot of interesting things to say, but it isn't a mystery.
I think that pinpoints exactly what I figured out after maybe 2.5 books, which is that it's not interesting that a crime takes place. Like if someone's siphoning water from Arizona to get it, that's not interesting in itself. You have to have like a reason that it's interesting, which usually involves character, or else a fiendishly clever plot, but I can't do those.
And in interesting fiction, a motive. Most domestic crimes are boring. It would make boring books because mostly it's two people or
drunk,
or just lose their tempers. You see in the paper today about the man who wanted his wife to shoot him and she refused, so he took the rifle and shot her instead. And I'm going, okay, but that's not going to be a mystery. That is really not ever going to be.
And that was an accident. If you read the whole article.
You're right. But that's the kind
of... Is this his story? What?
Well,
I can see so many holes in that. He's like, well, I asked her to shoot me and she wouldn't, so I shot her. The cops are like, oh, okay, well, have a great day.
I'm sure that there are many times when a law arrives on the scene to hear a story that is clearly not an accurate depiction of the facts. But, people lose their tempers, they get into a rage, weather can affect all kinds of stuff. But that's not...
Where is Rob?
Home cooking. I know where Rob is. Right. There's nothing to drive you to read that as a longer story than however long it was in the paper.
Yeah.
It's
That's
not going to
interesting.
support an entire book. And in fact, just one single crime is rarely enough to support an entire book. Usually there have to be subsidiary stuff going on, whether it's following a romance or, there's a secondary crime or, and some of it's totally unrealistic. I mean, in every Agatha Christie, when somebody dies, there's like 11 people at the scene, all of whom could have killed this person, all of whom have histories or, whatever motives. And so the object is to sift through to, opportunity in the whole bit. That's just as unrealistic as when there's just a single one.
Sure, but more fun.
Yeah, it makes a novel,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
the truth is that you're rarely going to find somebody murdered in a situation where everyone else in the room also would like to have killed this person.
I'm still waiting. I wake up every day and oh, maybe today's the day. Drawn into
What,
a
that
murder
you're going to be the
mystery.
person who's killed, or you're
I
going
just
to be
want
the
to be
person
someone who's briefly suspected and then gets is exonerated, but I'm involved. I saw some stuff and doesn't that sound?
So are you going to
Do I
try
sound like a crazy person?
a false confession? That's what you're going to do?
No. I just want to be the first person who's exculpated by the police. They're like, oh, Charlie couldn't have done it, but he was there, and we have to let him see everything that happens. I sound really weird. I know.
They're never going to let him be on a jury as soon as
No.
they find out what he did. So it's not going to be. I've never been able to serve on a jury.
Really?
No, they throw me out. Well, now I'm too old and I don't have to. But at that, I remember going over to Scottsdale. When I walked in, the judge and two of the lawyers just laughed. And then they said, "Well, sit over there until we, then you
That's
go
so
home."
funny.
And one of them came by and said, "If you got a book," sitting there reading over the, I mean. Lawyers do not want people on juries that really are invested in, investigating crimes, whatever it all is, because, the object is for each lawyer to tell the best possible story connected with their client and to see which one the jury, which explains why some jury verdicts are just, you can hardly believe them.
Yeah.
But at the time, in the courtroom, that lawyer was the more
Was the
compelling
better
storyteller. Right, exactly. There's
It's
some
kind of terrifying. if you think
amazing
about it.
incidents. Well, but that's the way the jury system works.
Sure.
You have to go with that. So, all right. So, what are you working on now? You just mentioned that you are back to the mature Lennox.
Yeah, back to, and I think this is going to be the first one where he goes to America. So I'm excited. That's, so maybe visits New York and maybe a little Newport and maybe he goes undercover. I'm not sure yet. Do you have any suggestions? The question I have is which character should go with him because I'm debating between his wife, his friend Graham, his friend McConnell, his brother. I want him to have this bonding trip with someone, but I'm still in the research stage, so.
McConnell.
You think so? Wow, okay.
He's an awesome character.
Wow,
Graham,
very
Graham.
definite opinion. You say Graham? Okay.
He is too. He's a
Interesting.
This is great.
That is
Take a
right.
vote, right?
I know, yeah.
But then when he totally ignores it,
Oh, I'm not going to ignore it. I'm thinking about
So
those two
cool.
ansers.
Did any of you see The Mystery of Edmund Drood? When
Didn't watch it.
what was the play? Well, the whole point of the play, I'm trying to remember because he's a really great guy and he wrote a couple of mysteries and I brought him out here and then I went to see one of his plays on
Dickens?
Broadway. I know, on his guest. But anyway, the point of The Mystery of Edmund Drood was, and the cast, was that they went right up to the moment, I think, right before the end when, I'm trying to remember whether Drood's body is, whatever it all is, and then they stopped the play and they asked each of the characters then put on a placard and they asked the audience to vote on how it was going to work out. Who did it? Why did it? Whatever. And every single night, therefore, the play on Broadway was different.
I love it.
And they brought it here to Gamage, and I remember going to see it, but it was so cool, because
That would save us so
you
much
had
work.
just-
Should we just start doing that? Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, just Rupert Holmes was the playwright, and Rupert Holmes wrote a couple of great mysteries. But anyway, here's your opportunity. You can
Right.
do a mystery of Edward Drood. Who goes with Lennox to America?
Exactly.
And you could have votes.
Just an
You could
Instagram
run
poll.
it. You could run it as like a Facebook contest or something. Who gets to go with Lennox to America?
I would be so resentful the minute I started writing if I'm gonna listen to those idiots. I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. I mean,
There you are. That's the whole point of being the author, right? You can be God in your book.
but I want someone to tell me, so I make no sense because I would love to run a Facebook poll, but then the minute I was stuck, I'd feel stuck. Do you know what I mean?
You're so contrary.
Yeah, I guess I have a lot of faults, Barbara. I don't know what to tell you.
We're just exposed to it. Well, anyway, it sounds very exciting.
Thank
Whoever
you.
you choose to bring to America will be
Thank you very much.
fascinating. Right. So, Karen, what are you working on? I know what you're working on. I have the manuscript at all.
Yeah, you have the manuscript. So I decided to try something slightly different. I have an inspector named Michael Corbin, who is a former bare knuckles boxer from Whitechapel. Became at age 19, he goes to Lambeth, becomes a uniform policeman, moves over to the River Police, moves over to Scotland Yard, and there is a series of beautifully dressed girls floating down the river in boats on Tuesday, and he is trying to figure out why and what they have in common. And
You didn't mention they were dead.
Oh yes, they're dead. Sorry, very dead. Strange.
Twist.
Dead. So, sorry. This is why I have Barbara. She reminds me of what I'm doing.
Remember, they're dead.
They're dead. Yes, they're all dead. And so this book came about because I'm interested in revenge. And because and Charles had better watch out. So I think sometimes we think somewhat simplistically about revenge as sort of this eye for an eye. And I about 7 years or so ago, if I heard this story, I read an article in the New Yorker. And it was about, I think it was in the New Yorker, and it was about race and the law here in the United States. And one of the vignettes that was included in the article was about a young black woman who had been jaywalking across a quiet street in Alabama. A car comes around the corner and hits her. The man who's driving is white. His car is nice. It's a Lexus or something. And he is slightly under the influence. Not completely drunk, but under the influence. And lands her in the hospital for months. And when they sue for damages, she's given $2,000. And this story clawed at me, and you know, for all it says about things like race and law in America, but what interested me was that her father went after the judge's daughter, and I began to think about how when satisfaction isn't given in the symbolic realm. I mean, obviously, we can never undo hitting someone with a car, but you're given an apology, you're given money, you're given, you know, maybe community service, jail time, you know, whatever it is, you're given some sign of acknowledgement. But when that doesn't happen, what happens next? And is this the father's way of trying to shake that judge and say, do you get it? What is it to lose your daughter, or to almost lose her? And in some senses, that kind of feeds into what Brené Brown talks about when she says our deepest need is to be seen and understood by someone else. So is revenge always simple, or is there sometimes an element of wanting the other person to get it? So that's sort of where this next book is going.
Sounds great.
It does sound great. Now, Diane, do you have anything you'd like to contribute to this discussion? I mean, we're just ignoring you back there, but you write wonderful Victorian mystery. What was you don't want to?
I don't. Do you have a question?
What are you working on?
Oh, okay. Right now I'm working on book 4, which let's see, we're at the point where George and Francis, my main characters, they've publicly announced they're throwing their engagement party, they're going to get married, and the only thing that can stand between them is his wife. A woman, she just comes about and declares herself to be Mrs. George Hazelton. You know, Francis doesn't know what to do, but when her body is found dead in Francis's garden, will she and George become the prime suspects.
You're such a devil. I love that. Diane's up
That's
for another
great.
award this year. Last year she won best first novel award
The debut,
at Left Coast Crime, and now I saw that you were up again for an award. So
yeah.
congratulations. That's really
Congratulations.
exciting.
That's so cool.
Right. We only get to keep her half the year. So, but as you know, I'm always excited about finding more local authors. Judith is one. Diana's one. Erin is one. Do we have anybody else there who's an actual writer? Published author.
Sandy.
Sandy. I'm sorry. Hi.
Well, that's all right.
So-
I published, but not books.
Published but not books.
Poetry, journal articles.
Oh, I'm
and
sorry.
so-
Oh, I see what
and
you mean. Not a novel is what you meant,
Well,
right?
I've just finished a novel.
Have you? Well, congratulations. That's so interesting. I think it's exciting that we have so much local talent. So, Ian, if you'd like to come, and we'll wave goodbye to our video audience, and thank you all for joining us in what I could only describe as a really disjointed discussion.
That's the only way you can describe it? I thought it was kind of fun.
It's been fun at all, but I don't know that we have any logical train.
Are they supposed to learn something? No.
No, they're just supposed to have a good time.
Oh, good, okay.
No.
Did you have a good time?
Yeah.
No.
Mild, lukewarm, yes.
All right. So there's not